All right, this is the second part lecture for the social contract theories. Previously, you would have listened to the Hobbes recording, and now we're going to look at Locke and Rousseau. Again, the other two to the three line up for social contract, all under the theme of political liberalism. All right. Outline. So we'll start with Locke. We'll look at who is John Locke, the problem of absolutism, natural law and natural rights, the Lockean view of human nature, the importance of property, looking at social contract and consent, sovereign power, and the right of resistance. And then we'll look at who is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, state of nature, human nature, civil society, social contract, sovereign and inequality. And before going any further, there are several concepts that are used, and they have different meanings for each scholar. Some are similar, some are different. They're all different intricacies, however, that you must account for. But you're always going to find a discussion of equality. You're going to find the term sovereign used across the board, and they don't all mean the same thing. You're going to find a discussion of state of nature, human nature. You're going to find social contract, rights, right, and that kind of stuff that's pretty much generic across the board. So just a little heads up right there. All right, so we'll start with Locke. All right, Locke was born in 1632 to 1704, which means he died at the age of 72. He was an English philosopher and a political theorist. He began his career as a scientist and political conservative. He was employed with the Earl of Shaftesbury. He became involved in Whig politics and was in opposition to James II of England. So remember that Locke, as an English philosopher, is coming after Hobbes. So just to do a little recap or transition, James II has now taken over England. He's pro-Catholic, pro-absolutism, right, during his reign. And of course, during that period in England, there's a fear of return to absolutism. So we have, just to put you in perspective, so now we're back to Locke. We know he's a scientist and a political conservative. And he's involved in Whig politics, which is in opposition to James II of England. His opposition to James, of course, forces him into exile in Holland, where he writes the two treatises of government, among some other works. The second treatise came to be considered by many as the theoretical justification for what happened in the Glorious Revolution in England of 1688, in which James II was forced from the throne and William of Orange was appointed King of England. This, however, was a peaceful transition insofar as it did not result in war. It also represented a shift to what was perceived by memory as a more favorable or better type of government. Locke's political theory differs from absolutist accounts of political power, as we saw Thomas Hobbes discuss last week. So, of course, he's opposed to James, so he's not interested in looking at absolutist perspectives of power. Okay. So let's start with what he considers to be the problem of absolutism. The problem of absolutism was both historical and a theoretical problem. Historically, monarchs have always ruled under council. So we had the Stuart kings believed in the divine right of kings to rule as they wish. We talked about this in the last presentation. However, although the king could rule without consulting Parliament on matters of law and policy, he was obligated to ask Parliament for money or to approve new taxes. So one problem historically is that there was a conflict between this right to rule and then the fact that there are parts of the ruling that required counsel or approval from Parliament. Another problem with absolutism theoretically was that it sought to address the challenges posed by Hobbes, who argued that sovereign political power must be absolute and unchangeable. Otherwise, civility and the benefits derived from society would be impossible. So a theoretical problem with absolutism for Locke was that even where Hobbes spoke for supporting non-royal families and moving to parliamentarianism, or he spoke about at time, his idea of a sovereign was also an absolute ruler The only difference here was this absolute ruler did not have the divine right to rule. He ruled because of force and ability, right? So he found that problematic. Um, Hobbes argued that even if we conceive of man as naturally free and equal, such men would be obligated to give us their natural equality to an would give up their natural equality to an absolute sovereign. Locke, on the other hand, wanted to show that men are not obligated to alienate all their rights to a sovereign who may turn out to be a threat to their religious beliefs. Instead, our rights place limits on the power of the sovereign. So this is the issue of the contract here. For Hobbes, the contract was a one-way contract, right? Which is questions the fact of whether you want to call it a contract at all. But it's a one-way agreement where individuals give up all their rights to someone who would act on their behalf and judge on their behalf with the good faith that they would do so in a just way. And Hobbes and Locke points out that, we're not obligated to give up all of our rights to a sovereign. And we don't even know, how much of a threat this person is. So really we're looking for a social contract where our rights place limits. In exchange for our rights, some limit should be put on the power of the sovereign. Next, he talks about natural law and natural rights. Locke argues that men are naturally free and equal. So here he agrees with Hobbes. He argues this in two senses. First, prior to the creation of the state, men were actually free and equal. Okay, as I said, Hobbes said that. Freedom and equality is a moral relation that exists even after the creation of civil and political society. And here's the difference. Hobbes doesn't talk about the morality. Hobbes separates morality from decision making in the artificial creation of society, right? As an artificial reality. Doesn't make any sense. Not artificial reality. Idea is that Hobbes believed that society was a man-made construct, so it wasn't natural; it was artificial. For Hobbes, moral relation is something that is separated out of sovereign decision making. A sovereign must be separate from religious influence and moral obligation. And for Locke here, freedom and equality is a moral relation that exists even after the creation of civil and political societies. So in a Hobbesian world, in a Hobbesian commonwealth, we give up all our freedom. So in that artificial construct, we have no freedom and we're no longer equal. We're not equal because we've given up our equality and our freedom in order to be inferior to the sovereign who now does anything he wants or she wants under the guise of our authority, right? And for Locke, that is not the case. That freedom and equality still exists in a moral relation, even after the creation of civil and political societies. So the question arises, how do we know we have such natural rights? Now, the freedom and equality in a moral relation implies that natural rights come from either nature or God and not from the government. So government cannot take away that which makes them inalienable. So let's try this again. Freedom and equality in a moral relation exists even at the creation of civil and political society. For Hobbes, the moment society is formed, or we lose our freedom and our equality because we've signed over those rights to an absolute monarch who will rule, who we have given authority to rule and judge for us, right? Locke argues that because our natural rights come from nature, they come from somewhere before the creation of government or political society, that under a government or political society, those rights cannot be taken away because they weren't derived there. It was something, these rights and duties were something already inherent in us. And so government cannot take away that which makes these rights which are inalienable rights. These rights would include the right to life, liberty or freedom, property, right of self-preservation, right to execute the law of nature. For Locke, rights are a creation of law. So to have a right is to benefit from others having rights. For me to have a right to life, you must be under duty not to kill me, and vice versa. And vice versa. Wow. Rights and duties go together, but rights are usually inferred from duty. Duty in turn are derived from laws, and it is laws that distribute the duties, which in turn shapes our rights. Okay, so I'll say it again. I'm losing my voice. Um, According to Locke, to have a right is to benefit from others having rights. And that the moment there's a right, there's a subsequent duty that follows. So if I have a right to life, you have a duty not to kill me, and vice versa, right? So if I have a right to life, you have a duty not to kill me. Rights and duties go together, but rights are inferred from duties. The only way to know what your right is to infer it from a duty. Duties in turn are derived from law, and it is law that distributes the duties, which in turn shapes our rights. So one thing we've learned here is that natural rights are considered, for Locke, inalienable rights, something that cannot be taken away with the formation of society. So society has no right to take away our rights, right? We have a duty to protect our rights. That means you have a right. We have a duty to make sure that you live. So you have a duty to life. We have a duty to protect your freedom, which means you have a right to freedom. We have a duty to ensure you have some place to live. You have a right to property. And so the relationship between duty and rights. Let's now look at the Lockean view of human nature and the state of nature. Like Hobbes, Locke draws a distinction between the state of nature and the political state. Again, this is part of the social contract thing. Unlike Hobbes, who saw humans as egotistical and in need of control, Locke sees humans as rational and tolerant individuals who can, by and large, control themselves. Right? So for Hobbes, man is egotistical, in need of control, and Locke sees humans as rational and tolerant individuals who can, by and large, control themselves. Unlike Hobbes, the state of nature, where there's no justice or injustice, no right or wrong, Locke's state of nature is a moral state. Remember, we talked about this, he used the word moral. It's a moral state, the state into which we're all born as humans, where we are all bestowed with certain God-given natural rights, the right to life, liberty, and property. And this should be a very common phrase to you because it's used in the U.S. Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and property. Right? So here we have Locke identifying 3 natural rights as opposed to Hobbes's 1. 3 natural rights for Locke is the right to life, liberty, and property. And for Hobbes, the only natural right we have is the right to self-preservation. So there's another difference. Hobbes insists that there is no such thing to a right to property, since in nature there is no property, just possessions. And then, of course, clearly for Locke, right to property is one of the basic rights, one of the basic natural rights. So there's another difference there. Locke believes mankind was good, moral, honest, reasonable. So just rehashing, a state of nature is a moral state as opposed to instinctual. So for Hobbes, it's instinct. Man is instinctual. And for Locke, man operates and lives in a moral state. For Locke, he sees authority derived from God versus a philosophical approach where nature presupposes God's existence. There's a focus on property versus possession, and presupposes a natural state of abundance versus a natural state of scarcity. Okay, that I had not mentioned. So in Lockean's world, there's a state of abundance. There's food excess everywhere, food and protection and security and anything that is desired by man. And according to Hobbes, in Hobbesian world, men operate in a state of nature, and it's all about self-preservation and instincts and doing what you must to survive. All right. So let's focus a little bit more on this idea or importance of property. The idea behind Locke's concept of natural law and natural right is one of property. The idea of property is not merely a secondary right to material goods. It goes to the heart of Lockean account of rights and help explains why property existed prior to political society and also why it places constraints on sovereign political power. So remember, three primary rights for Locke is life, liberty, and property. And so property is not a secondary right, it's a primary right. And because it's a primary right, it is one of the things that constrains the political power of the sovereign. That's something we must look at because for Locke, property existed prior to political society. So he develops this importance of property by looking at the state of nature. And Locke claims that in a state of nature, man has a right to whatever part of nature he has mixed his labor with. Right? Man has a right to whatever part of nature he has mixed his labor with. So if I till the soil, or I cut down a tree, and I make a house from it, then this garden or that house are mine, and will be my children's when they inherit them from me. Right? So he claims that in a state of nature, man has a right to whatever part of nature he has mixed his labor with. So if I till the soil, cut down a tree, make a house from it, then the garden or that house are mine, and then my children when they inherit them from me. Now, this writing reflects the ideology of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which we spoke about in the intro. The overthrow of King James II through a union between English parliamentarians and Dutch leader William II, Prince of Orange, who was married to James II's daughter Mary. Mary was 26 at the time and a Protestant, and there was a growing concern over James II's desire for a return to Catholicism and its close tie to France. And this came to the head with the birth of James II's second son. Although his second child, he was his firstborn son, and that would now prevent what was an assured Protestant from occupying the throne on James II's death. This made the possibility of a return to Catholic England more of a reality. So forces of Parliament had won, and they selected Marian and William as their new monarchs. And the Glorious Revolution limited the power of the royal family and forced them to live by the Magna Carta, which is the English Bill of Rights. And then you have the U.S. Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the French Revolution 1789 to 1799. Right? And so this discussion of property really reflects the ideology of the Glorious Revolution at that time. So for Locke, one can accumulate as much natural property as one can use as long as it does not spoil in its accumulation. Right? As long as enough has been left for others, and as long as its accumulation is not harmful to others. As you can see, if you even have a slight interest in property rights, this is very problematic. Because, for example, land does not spoil. Trees, fruits, vegetation, food on the land may spoil, but the land does not spoil. So what it's saying here is quite okay for an individual to have a significant amount of property, while another can have none, as long as there's enough left for others. Right? Meaning that whether it's attainable or not, that the fact that there's many left. So for example, if we were in a valley and I was to claim all the viable land in a valley and then leave you with like a little dry squat here or a mountain range there, and I say, well, you also have access to land, I would not be breaking my natural property rights. And then as long as the accumulation is not harmful to others. If we digress from property and start thinking about money and finance, accumulating physical cash may not necessarily harm someone overtly, but indirectly I'm diminishing access to resources for somebody else. So the importance of property is slanted very much to the property than to the affluence. So the cartoon is very telling. It says there's someone coming out of a palatial estate, maybe a royal, because it looks like it's his manor above, and there's one of his serfs or peasants working in a little square little box. That's all he has. And he says, "What are you complaining about? You have plenty of your meager needs, right?" And all around him is boxed in, no trespassing, no hunting, no fishing. So it makes that concept problematic. And what we're seeing here are political systems that are created on the backbone of property rights, and property rights slanted towards the affluent, which is problematic. But that's for a different discussion at a different time. All right. But what's important to know is the import that is given to property in terms of the social contract. If we're having a larger discussion of who is considered a member or a person of social contract and who isn't, you can see right here that if you are without property, then you nothing here qualifies you as being equal before the eyes of the law, for example. This brings us now to a more detailed look at the social contract and consent, according to Locke. So he does see selfishness happening, and so agreeing with his idea by Hobbes about the selfishness of man, and the inconveniences of the state of nature give us a reason to establish political society, or the state. So he's agreeing with Hobbes in the sense that eventually man is selfish, and that it becomes inconvenient to exist in a state of nature, right? And so the need for political society is necessary. But we have to understand again the context. Because he believes in life, liberty, and property, the idea here is the more congested society gets, the more there's conflict over property rights, the greater the need is for political society, because it becomes inconvenient, and because men get selfish, they don't share, so resources become scarce for some. But if we are naturally free of any notions of political obligation, duty to obey the state and the law cannot just be required of us. We must freely choose it. At least that's what Locke says. So if we are naturally free of any notion of political obligation, the duty to obey the law and the state cannot just be required of us. We must freely choose it. So unlike Hobbes, where social contract is a political obligation in order for us to self-preserve, Locke believes that it's something we must freely choose, because we have a right of freedom, and therefore, because we have a natural right to freedom, this freedom can only be given up freely. Consequently, the origin of political authority must be agreed upon among those subjected to it. So within the contract, we also have a significant say in who our political authority is. All right. However, Locke is aware that his argument seems only to justify the establishment of political authority among the original contractors. Because if you're saying that we must agree upon who this is, and a contract is formed, then what happens down the line? If you're not a part of the original contract, then how do you find a space? So if that is the case, right? If his rationale justifies the establishment of political authorities among the original contractors, how has he rendered political authority consistent with freedom unless each generation contracts anew? And so he talks about this. He talks about consent. He distinguishes between express and tacit consent. Express consent is straightforward and involves explicit agreements in such as promises and oaths of allegiance. And then he talks about tacit consent. This does not have to be given in a conscious agreement. Indeed, it can be inferred from such familiar acts as enjoying the benefits of a political society or walking along the highway. All men have the opportunity to tacitly consent. Therefore, the law of the land will be consistent with one's freedom. So, indeed, you might want to consider whether Locke's account of tacit consent is too successful, so much so that we cannot actually withhold consent. All right, so food for thought here. Because in a natural state, you already have freedom. It's something you must freely give. The idea here about the contract is that if my grandparents and your grandparents sat down at a table and came up with a contract regarding how you and I will interact, right? And they pass away, and the contract is still valid. There's an idea there that we have lost our freedom because we had no part as the original constructors of the contractors, the original contractors, to make any changements. So did we really utilize our free will, right? That's the question. And what Locke is saying is that there are two types of consent. There is express consent, which is straightforward, which is what our grandparents would have done. They've given their express consent. And then there's tacit consent, which is support given, which can be inferred from our actions. So the fact that you and I still carry out the interaction according to the contract, even though we were not there at the table, then we've tacitly agreed to the terms of the contract. And so in that way, we have not impinged on our freedom to choose because we're still modeling and carrying out. The question I raise at the end is that you might want to consider whether Locke's account of tacit consent is too successful, so much so we cannot actually withhold consent. It's similar to the free rider problem. Now, in a social contract, the original contractors have made this contract in relation with the government in order to give up some rights in exchange for, right? 200 years down the line, the fact that you're a part of society, you are raised in society, grown up in society, no one can deny you your rights. No one can withhold consent from you, regardless of whether you want it or not. So the contract is kind of also weird because there's no enforcement. I can't withhold your access to safety and security, even though you break the contract by doing something illegal. Until I catch you, you're still benefiting from all these things. Even if you are caught, you're going to prison and you're still treated fairly. You're still treated justly, even if you're convicted of a crime and you're guilty. You still are given right to life. You still have the freedom to take walks in the day, play in the yard, even though you can't leave. Some of your freedom, some of the rights that you have, and your natural rights, are inherent, and we cannot actually withhold consent on that. And something of that nature is what a critique of Locke's is trying to get at. So, so here we have the Lockean social contract with the people, and our three natural rights, inalienable rights: life, liberty, and property, which also includes self. We have our equal rights and life, liberty, and the power to judge. So these two are coming from Locke, right? And that we transfer some of our power for you to deal with inconveniences in order to deal with inconveniences of a natural state, in order to get security and protection from a political state, and that political state will give us leadership of our choosing and judgment, right? Right? And that's how we maintain a social contract. So political legitimacy equals consent, whether express or tacit, which I mentioned earlier. All right, now let's look at the sovereign power and the right of resistance. So Locke has shown us how political authority is created through an original contract, and how its legitimacy is confirmed through time by acts of tacit and express consent. He assumes that this majority will is then delegated to a representative body, a government that acts on behalf of the people. So what we find here is that in the Lockean perspective, he proposes a separation of powers between the legislative function and the executive branch of government. The idea is taken up and formalized in the Constitution of the United States of America almost a century later, because remember I told you that life, liberty, property are key parts of the U.S. Constitution. So we find that this separation of powers and application, social contract is applied in and formalized in the Constitution of the United States of America almost a century later. So government is a trust exercised on behalf of the sovereign people. As a trust, government can be removed. These are all terms of contract. Lockean government is a middle ground between absolutism and anarchy. Limited government that protects natural rights. So it's a right-based government that protects natural rights. Because it's a mutual relationship, the implication here is that the government can be removed. And that this type of government is not an absolute government, but it's also not anarchy, or as some of the scholars before us have indicated, it's not a full-fledged democracy. All right. So it says people have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. Rulers have a responsibility to protect these rights. People have the right to change a government that it fails to do so. Men being from by nature equal, free, equal, and independent, no one can put him out of his estate and subject to the political power of another without his own consent. Okay. This also brings up the question of legitimacy, legitimate versus illegitimate states. Unlike Hobbes, he can identify between the two. For Hobbes, there's no illegitimate state. The formation of a state is a monarchical state, and so it's even if it's unfair, it's legitimate. Therefore, for Locke, there's a distinct difference between a legitimate versus illegitimate state. For Locke, political states or governments are evaluated on their ability to protect the natural rights of the individual living in those states. So obviously, a good state will be one that guarantees and maximizes the rights. A bad state is one that does not guarantee them, and an evil state is one that assaults the natural rights. In this way, Locke is able to provide a theory of justifiable revolutions, unlike the theory proposed by Hobbes. So when a government acts against the civil interests of its subject, it acts against the law of nature, and so our obligation to it ceases. Challenging such a government is not rejecting a rightful obligation. Instead, it is a means of self-protection. Applying the right of resistance does not put us back in the state of nature. It merely distinguishes the absence of obligation to a particular government. We're not rebelling against the idea of social contract, just over a specific social contract within state that is evil. All right, so what he's saying here, this is how he resolves the mutual elements of the contract. In this version, a contract is mutual. So I give up some of my rights in exchange. You provide security and judgment. But because he starts out on a premise of morality, then clearly there's going to be morality applied to the political society as well. And here he divides morality in terms of looking at whether a state is good, bad, or evil, and then how does that factor into this the mutual contract. So a good state is one that guarantees and maximizes the rights. A bad state is one that does not guarantee them, and an evil state assaults those rights. So in some instances, a revolution is actually justifiable. In the cases where our rights are impinged upon, we can, as a people, change the government or demand change in a government. And that this shift does not mean that we're breaking away from social contract. Rather, we're breaking away from the contract between an obligation to a specific government, who in this case would be characterized as either bad or evil. All right. This brings us to Rousseau, a somewhat shorter presentation actually. Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, he was age 66. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland, into a Protestant family of French refugees. His mother died at birth, and he was raised by a father who was a watchmaker. From my understanding, Rousseau had no formal education, which is very interesting compared to the other scholars. He later moved to France, where he's a wanderer of sorts. He's considered a wanderer of sorts. He wrote the discourse on origin and basis of inequality among men in 1755, and then he wrote about on the social contract in 1762. All right. For state of nature here, Rousseau rejects Locke's account of the state of nature, and he also rejects his Hobbes. His conception of state of nature is not as depressing as Hobbes, neither was it as positive as Locke. He saw the state of nature as a period of peaceful happiness, which was governed by the law of self-preservation. His account of people in the state of nature have them as solitary beings, driven by their gentle passions, seeking the first social ties, and describes our social nature where pity is a natural sentiment. Thus, man could give up his freedom without rejecting his humanity, with its right and parallel duties. Rousseau insists that man in the state of nature was free and equal, essentially good and sympathetic. He cautions us to be careful to not confuse savage man with those we see now. All right. So similarly to Rousseau and to Locke, he sees men as being free and equal. So this also means that the social contract theorists all start out with that premise. But for Rousseau, man is essentially good, unlike Hobbes, who sees man as inherently bad. He says man is essentially good and sympathetic. Notwithstanding the increase in human population and search for private property, a time would come when man could no longer live in isolation and independently guard his rights, but would be forced by rational estimation to give up his natural freedom. And this would would be involuntarily faced with the issue of setting up a form of society that protects the whole collective force, the person and property of each member, and to the benefit of everyone, while uniting himself to all, but remain as free as possible. So for Rousseau, the social contract liberates people from the rude state of nature. So for him, the state of nature is not peaceful. This peace is temporary, and it's temporary because the evolution of nature creates a fraction in the social structure of man, meaning that as nature develops, as we have increasing population, as people start searching for property, as people start getting into each other's space and impinging on people's rights, there is a need, a desperate need to form society. And so it's not something that man wants. He's involuntarily faced with it. It's something he has to come to terms with. And the state of nature is how, and this move towards society is how man gets liberated from this very rude state of nature. And the contract does not change people or their rights, but rather it offers guarantees. It guarantees individualism by prohibiting excessive individualism or self-interest. So he goes one step further than Hobbes and Locke, and he points out that inequality actually is natural, but only when it relates to physical differences between man. So he's only also reinforcing the point that equality is common in the social state or natural state, and that when inequality is natural, it has to do with physical differences. Anything other than that would not be natural. It would be like a social construct. In modern societies, however, inequality derived from a process of human evolution that has corrupted man's nature and subjected him to laws and property, both of which support a new, unjustified kind of inequality termed moral inequality. This is an unacceptable situation according to Rousseau. The source of inequality comes from our needs for others. So very interestingly enough, all two scholars also highlight that, but less overtly. The fact that social contract actually creates inequality, right, between those who lead and those who don't lead. So society is a source of inequality. There's exploitation, arbitrary rule, conflict, the invention of private property, and division of labor are all aspects of society. And these kind of inequalities, he argues, leads to conflicts. So he believes that property allows for the misuse of the poor by the rich. The relationship between the rich and the poor is deceitful and unbalanced, usually resulting in a violent state of war. In an effort to get away from the state of war, the rich deceive the poor into creating a political society. Um, Rousseau's account of the operation of society focuses on its various stages. Beginning with the trick played by the rich, he sees society as becoming more and more unequal, unlike the last stage, until the last stage, which is despotism, or the unjust rule of everyone by one man. This development is not inevitable, but is extremely likely. As wealth becomes the standard by which men are compared, conflict and despotism becomes possible. For Rousseau, the worst kind of modern society is that where money is the only measure of value. Yeah, so he believes in direct democracy, which is very strange. However, he does not factor in women, and many of his views was radicalized in the French Revolution. However, Rousseau's political vision centers on a society where people share the same interests, avoid policies that divide them against one another, accept the wisdom and virtue of the sovereign, and contribute their chaste power to the larger public happiness. All right. I hope this helped. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know.